Hello, my name is Teresa Rademacker, and my research topic is on the investment practices of Warren Buffett. I've been studying Warren Buffett and his method of value investing. And the question is, why is it meaningful? Why should we study it? This reminds me of a quote from The Snowball, Warren Buffett and the Business of Life by Ann Schroeder. She writes, "You'd get rich if you thought of yourself as having a card with only 20 punches in a lifetime, and every financial decision used up one punch. You'd resist the temptation to dabble. You'd make more good decisions, and you would make more big decisions." So there are many different ways to invest, and oftentimes they're becoming more and more complex. Value investing is not the most hyped up way to invest, and it's definitely not the easiest. But it does provide crucial information about the company, its financials, and it reduces risk. So as I go through this presentation, I want you to pretend you only have 20 punches on your financial punch card. My hope is that you will have some key takeaways that could help you understand more about why Warren Buffett chose value investing and how it can be used effectively. As we dive into Warren Buffett's investment playbook, we first define what value investing is. It is a strategy used by investors to seek out and purchase stocks that are undervalued in the stock market. Warren Buffett referred to companies as cigar butts because he would find a company that is discarded and that have one last puff left in them. So what does value investing entail? It entails running calculations from financial statements and understanding the company's history of generating revenue. It also looks at the company to see if it has a wide economic moat. And I'm going to run you through a scenario that Warren Buffett most likely performs so that you can get an idea of how the process works. Later in the presentation, I'm going to discuss Berkshire Hathaway's structure as a holding company and why it's so important to Warren Buffett's legacy. Its structure is very unique, and we'll discuss its valuation and hopefully provide some insight into the future of Berkshire Hathaway with its new CEO, Greg Abel. So the valuation process is really comprised of two steps: the discounted cash flow and the intrinsic value. So the discounted cash flow requires calculating the cash flow over the lifetime of the company, then discounting them back to the present value. Now, we have to make some assumptions with a DCF valuation. So we're going to start off by first picking a forecast period, which will be 5 to 10 years. Next, we will pick a growth rate based on historical growth and a terminal growth rate. After that, we will pick the discount rate, and then we will calculate the cash flow and discount it back with the discounted rate. Now on the right-hand side here, I have its calculation. So we have the discounted cash flow, and it's equal to the summation of each free cash flow calculation year per year. So for example, this first one is the free cash flow for year one divided by 1 plus the discount rate to the exponent of 1, which is represented by the year. For the second year, it would be the free cash flow for year 2 divided by 1 plus the discount rate to the exponent of 2. And we continue to do that until we reach the free cash flow of the terminal length of time plus 1 plus the discount rate to the terminal length of time. So this is great, but let's go through an example. And let's use Coca-Cola. And the reason we're using Coca-Cola is because in 1989, Warren Buffett was very interested in Coca-Cola. So we're going to run a DCF valuation so we can get an idea as to why Warren Buffett was so interested in them. Okay, so how do we calculate the valuation process? So we have to make a few assumptions. So the first one that we're going to use is a forecast period of 10 years. With the growth rate, I picked a 15% growth rate. Remember that we have to look at historical data whenever we're performing valuation calculations. So the last 3 years prior to 1989, the growth rate was actually 20%, but since I decided to go out 10 years, I felt like 15% was a reasonable growth rate assumption. And then the discount rate at the time was 9%, which is actually the Treasury bond rate in 1989. So why do we use Treasury bond rate? The simplest answer is that the discount rate is oftentimes the Treasury bond rate because economists would have to see that the United States as a whole and the Treasury would have to go bankrupt in order for Treasury bonds to fail. And since the United States is the most wealthiest country in the world, that seems really highly unlikely. So in this calculation, I'm using the 9% Treasury bond rate. So what I discovered is I created a graph. Now this is not a calculation for each iteration. It's actually the summation year over year. So you can see that it's compounded to its final value here in the total plus 10 years plus terminal value here. And the DCF valuation that was calculated was 63.7 billion USD dollars. Now at the time in 1989, Coca-Cola was valued at 16.3 billion USD. So it was definitely undervalued. And so now we're starting to get an idea of why Warren Buffett might have wanted to dig into this company a little bit further with the valuation, because we're already off to a good start. So the second step in the valuation process is determining the intrinsic value. And the intrinsic value determines if the value of the stock is under or overpriced compared to the stock market price. And it's a fairly straightforward calculation. The intrinsic stock value is equal to the discounted cash flow valuation divided by shares outstanding. So since we've already calculated the DCF valuation for Coca-Cola, let's continue with it and find out how the intrinsic value compared to the actual stock market value at the time in 1989. So looking at the intrinsic value of Coca-Cola, we have the DCF valuation, which we just calculated, which is $63.7 billion. And the shares outstanding in 1989 were 364 million. Which, when we do this calculation, we get an intrinsic stock value of $175 per share. And at the time, in 1989, the stock market value was $45. This was a good buy. Now, I think it's important to let you know that these were estimations. What I calculated were all just estimations. We don't know for sure what forecast period, what growth rate, terminal growth rate Warren Buffett actually picked in 1989. But these estimates are completely reasonable, and chances are he probably picked similar numbers. But what we do know is that Berkshire Hathaway has 400 million shares of Coca-Cola. So here are a few other determinants for a good investment that Warren Buffett looks at. So the first one that we want to discuss is return on equity. And for this example, I'm going to fast forward to the present, but still use Coca-Cola as the example. So return on equity is how well the company can take investments and turn them into equity. So ROE is equal to the net income divided by the average total shareholders' equity. So if we were using the 2024 financial statements, we would take the 2023 total shareholders' equity and 2024 and take the average of those. So that's what I did and came up with an ROE of 39.5%. Now, Coca-Cola is in the non-alcoholic beverage industry. So when you compare it to the industry average is 21.8%, which is good. The next thing that we want to look at is the debt to equity ratio. This is a leverage ratio. And basically what it is it tells us how much the company relies on its shareholders to cover its debts. So the debt to equity ratio is equal to the total liabilities divided by the total shareholders' equity for that year. So taking the 2024 numbers for both of these, for the liabilities and shareholders' equity, I got a equity or debt to equity ratio of 2.82. And again, looking at the industry average, it was the industry average is 0.84, which isn't great in comparison. And there could be some reasons why it might be high. Honestly, some companies are used to it. Some industries actually run higher than a normal debt to equity ratio. Honestly, if the financials look good and you find an outlier, there might be information available in the financial statements, like the manager's discussion, that might shed a light as to why you might find an outlier. And then the last thing that Warren Buffett also really takes a good deep look at is economic moats. And an economic moat is how well the company can protect its assets and its future earnings. So I've listed a few here and a few examples. These are not all of them, but just to give you an idea of what they look like. So one common one is startup cost. If the cost is too high to enter the market, that could be definitely a deterrent. So like thinking about cargo shipping and oil and gas production, things that cost a lot of money to enter into the market. If you don't have the capital, you're probably not going to be able to start that type of business. Switching costs. Switching costs can be high, and it can also be time consuming. I think a good example of this is Apple. If you think about all the computers and phones and like iPads and all the like headphones, things like that, chargers. There's so many things in Apple that pair with each other. So if you wanted to completely switch away from Apple products, it might be costly for the consumer to do so. And then the last one is intangible assets. That could be technologies, patents, licenses, and branding to protect its assets. I think about Hermes. Hermes has fantastic craftsmanship. They also have patents. So it could be very likely that because of that craftsmanship and that patent that they can charge what they do for their ridiculously expensive products. Right, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire Hathaway started off as a merger of Berkshire Fine Spinning and Hathaway Manufacturing. And this merger occurred in the 1970s, and they were associated with cotton textiles. And Berkshire Hathaway is a holding company. So Warren Buffett was actually more interested in insurance companies, so he started to move away from the textile industry, even though he would circle back to it later. But through the acquisition of insurance companies like Geico, he was able to set up Berkshire Hathaway as a holding company. So basically what he did is he would find these companies through value investing and purchase them or have major holdings in them and allow the companies to use the insurance premiums that were received to bankroll their operations. So instead of taking on a lot of debt, it bankrolled itself. Therefore, he allowed these companies to also operate and make their own strategic decisions. Warren Buffett has been a hands-off person and has allowed these holding companies to keep their autonomy for the most part. So a fun fact about Berkshire Hathaway. So around the time that BRK issued its first B stock, the more affordable option of stock, analysts were asking him, hey, why did you do this? And what Warren noticed was that mutual funds and unit trusts were popping up, trying to mimic what he was doing, essentially trying to erode his wide economic moat. The difference between a holding company and these lookalikes are that they typically invest in stocks, borrow the money, and then charge a 2% management fee. Berkshire Hathaway doesn't do any of that. So for example, if you had invested $1,000 in Berkshire Class A stock in 1965, then it would be worth $42 million in 2024. So if you were to take the same amount of money and invested it in a hedge fund, it would only be worth $5 million. This goes back to Warren's desire to return money to its shareholders and to not erode the stock's price with management fees. So Warren Buffett, he's 93 years old, and so many people have been wondering who would take over as Berkshire Hathaway's new CEO. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's longtime business partner, alluded to the eventual succession back in 2021 when he said in an interview that Greg Abel would maintain the culture of Berkshire Hathaway. And it has since been announced that he will be starting as its new CEO starting January 1st, 2026. There's not a lot of information out there on Greg Abel's approach to investing, but what we do know is he has been more involved and has a hands-on approach, more so than what Warren Buffett ever did. So the question on a lot of investors' minds is, how will this transition affect Berkshire Hathaway's stock prices? While we don't know yet what impact Greg Abel will have on the company in the future, we can do an evaluation calculation on Berkshire Hathaway and try to predict what its future earnings will be and how the intrinsic value of stock compares to the stock price, the market value is now. Okay, so I'll start with a DCF valuation of Berkshire Hathaway. And just like I did before with Coca-Cola, for this one, I'm using the same forecast period of 10 years and a growth rate of 10%. I use 10% growth rate, which is in line with the historical growth rate that Berkshire Hathaway has seen in recent years. The terminal growth rate, I brought it down again to 5%. And then the discount rate is 4.5%, which is equal to the current Treasury bond rate. So when I do this calculation, and again, you can see this graph on the right-hand side, you can see the summation over to give the total valuation. The DCF valuation is $585 billion, but wait, current valuation of Berkshire Hathaway is 1.05 trillion USD dollars. It's a big discrepancy. In fact, the DCF valuation is only 50% of its current valuation. I hate to say this, but it sounds like Berkshire Hathaway might be overvalued. Okay, so let's look at the intrinsic value of both Berkshire Class A and B stocks. So we were given the DCF value, or we calculated the DCF value of $585 billion. So we can calculate the intrinsic stock value. But unfortunately, before we do this, we have to take into account that Class A and Class B have differing amounts of outstanding stock. So first we have to weigh the volume and price of each so that we can accurately report our findings. So I won't bore you with that calculation, but what we do find is that for the intrinsic stock value of Berkshire A, this intrinsic value calculation is $203,042. The stock market value is right now $728,200. It's overvalued. And when we look at Berkshire Hathaway Class B, the intrinsic stock value is $135.60, and the stock market value is $485.14. So, unfortunately, these calculations also say that Berkshire Hathaway stock is overvalued. Now, we have to remember there's a lot to consider about Berkshire Hathaway. It's a complicated holding company, and there's no other company like it. What might give us a more accurate reporting is if we sum and weighted the calculations of each of its holding companies, but there's literally dozens of them. A software computing system would be able to do it, but the initial values of its free cash flow that I used for this algorithm come straight from its 2024 annual report. So we tend to see over time the market likes to correct to overvalued and undervalued companies. Otherwise, why else would we invest in undervalued companies in the first place? So based on this data, I would not recommend purchasing Berkshire Hathaway stock. The one exception would be if you were looking to purchase Class B stock and you were also looking to save money on your car insurance. Since Geico is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, they offer stockholders a savings of $160 annually. So in theory, if you held your Geico insurance for 3 years, you would make your money back. Now, as I wrap up this presentation, we've got a few key takeaways. So the truth is, there will never be another Warren Buffett, and he was always quick to give advice and to teach the practical guidelines for value investing. He was always transparent and remains critical of investment styles that carry unnecessary risk to the investor. We went through the calculations for discounted cash flow, valuation, and determining the intrinsic stock value, along with the considerations for the return on equity percentage, debt to equity ratio, and the importance of economic moats. So as we say farewell to Warren Buffett, and as Berkshire Hathaway embraces Greg Abel as its new CEO, we may discover that Abel will embrace riskier or different methods to investing. And it does yet remain to be seen if value investing will continue to be the best approach, especially as new methods gain more momentum. But value investing remains rooted in calculation and investing in solid businesses that produce great products. So I'll leave you with the question I asked you to ponder at the beginning of this presentation. If you were given a punch card and you were only allowed 20 punches on your financial punch card, what would you do? Thank you.